Yeah. The multi-scale competency architecture is basically this notion that in biology, and there's no reason why we can't, it's not uniquely biological. I mean, today it is, but in the future, there's no reason why we can't, as engineers, all can't use this. Is this idea that we are not only nested kind of hierarchical beings in a structural sense. So we all know, there are chemical networks that make up cells, that make up tissues and organs, and so on. So there's this hierarchy, but it's not just a structural scale hierarchy. It's a hierarchy in which every layer and component of that hierarchy is itself a goal-directed agent, meaning that it has some competency. It may be very profound, maybe very, very, very subtle competency to solve problems in some specific space. So there are cells that solve problems in metabolic and physiological spaces, and then there are tissues and organs that solve problems in anatomical morphous spaces, and then they give rise to a human, for example, that or any other motile animal that might solve problems in three-dimensional space, and maybe later you learn to operate in linguistic space, and who knows what else there is. So this has many profound implications. I mean, one implication is that well, oftentimes people will make this distinction. They will say, well, there are collective intelligences, right? So ant colonies and termites and bird flocks and so on. And then there are real intelligences like me. And so then maybe I consider a termite mound a real, a collective intelligence, and maybe I don't. But you have to make the case that this is like a real entity SI. Well, the thing is, there are no all intelligences are collective intelligences because all intelligences are made of parts. There is no such thing as this like immutable diamond of intelligence that is like a single indivisible thing. It's impossible. So we are all, you and I are bags of cells, basically, right? We are all made of these competent little pieces of components that are neurons and other things. And the big puzzle here is to understand how the competencies of the individual parts give rise to a whole that to the next level up that has goals and competencies in a completely different space. And right, and okay, so that's one kind of implication, to really understand that there are no non-collective intelligences. We are all made of parts. The second implication is for engineering. You can ask this question. I sometimes give a talk called "Why Don't Robots Get Cancer?" So you can start thinking about this idea that right now, the way we build most of our technology, you hope, let's say some sort of autonomous robotics, you hope that there's some intelligence at the higher level, but the parts are completely passive. The parts are not doing anything, right? For by and large. I mean, of course, there's now efforts in smart materials and things like that. So the good news is that you never face the problem of robot cancer, meaning that the parts are never going to go off and do something different because they have their own agenda and the coordination is broken down. So that's good. And so that makes them more predictable and maybe a little more boring. The bad news is that, and we can talk about this, some of the most amazing properties of living things come from the fact that all of these levels are cooperating and competing against each other. So the fact that there are multiple levels that solve independent problems is hugely important. And so that leads me to the third implication, which is for evolution. Now, I'll just give you a very simple example. We've shown that if you have a tadpole and you put an eye on its tail instead of in its head, those animals can still see. The eye can connect to the spinal cord. The brain can recognize information coming from its tail somehow, and those animals can still see. Similarly, if you make a tadpole where the craniofacial organs are scrambled and the mouth is sort of off to the side, during the steps towards metamorphosis, all of this stuff will sort of rearrange, and you'll get a pretty normal face out of it. Those now, what are those? Those are competencies of the individual organs. It means that if you induce an eye on the tail or a mouth off to the wrong place, they have the competency to still get their job done. The cells will do what they need to do to get as close to normal as possible. This has massive implications for evolution, because if you didn't have this, if you had an organism that was basically Lego, right, where every piece just goes exactly wherever the genome to put it, that's where it goes. Okay, and I'm not sure there are any organisms like this. Maybe C. elegans, maybe, I'm not sure. But if you had organisms like this, then anytime you had a mutation, let's say that you had a mutation, and like all mutations, it does multiple things. it let's say that it moves the mouth off to the side, but also does something useful somewhere else. Well, evolution would never get to see the useful part because that animal would starve and the fitness is zero. And as you would expect, most mutations would be negative. They would be deleterious. And so the search space, right, that evolution would have to search would be really rugged because you would have to wait until you found a different mutation that did the good thing but not move them out. That might be very hard. It might be impossible. Um, okay. However, in contrast, imagine that you had an animal which is much more realistic, where the parts had some competencies, and so now this mutation shifts the mouth or the eye, and it also does something else. Well, now those parts will get back to where they need to go. They will be functional. So now evolution gets to explore the other consequences of that mutation. So by having the parts be competent, it greatly smooths and alters the landscape of that evolution has to search because um, now all those potentially negative mutations are neutral because the competencies of the parts can sort of make up for a lot of that. So so that has a couple of interesting implications. The obvious one that's obvious and one that's really not obvious. The obvious one is that it makes things much more evolvable. And so it means that you're now searching instead of searching a really difficult space of all of micro positioning of all this stuff, you're searching some kind of a reward space where it's really behavior shaping, right? Your material is not passive; it's an agential material. Your cells already have capabilities and preferences and the signal processing and so on. So what you're searching is the signals that will get them to do specific things. The not obvious thing is that by having competent parts, you are hiding a lot of information about the genome from selection. Because if selection gets hold of a pretty good individual, you can't tell whether that's a good individual because the genome was amazing or because the genome is actually not very good, but all the parts sort of made up for it, right? So maybe the genome had all kinds of problems with where the eye is supposed to go in the mouth, but by the time selection acts, everything's where it needs to be. That sets up a positive feedback loop that becomes an intelligence ratchet because the more competency you have, the less evolution is able to select for better genomes. And the only work that can happen at that point is to select for more competency because you can't select for better hardware because you don't see the hardware. You don't see the genetics that specify the hardware. But what you might be able to do in evolution is to improve the competency. And so therefore there's this kind of runaway effect where that's I think that's and if you want to talk more about this, I have an example with planaria that I can talk illustrate this. But the idea is that it just sort of selects for this incredible competency of morphogenesis that is able to make up for all kinds of perturbations and so on for this reason.
Is that sort of a signifier of intelligence that you're using? The ability to uh, solve whatever goal is at relevant at that level, despite all sorts of changes, all sorts of challenges.
I, Yeah, I mean, so of course there are many definitions of intelligence, and I'm not saying mine is the only one. There are many good ones, but the one that I like that's appropriate for our work is one that William James pulled out, and his idea was basically the ability to reach the same goal by diverse means. So that's very interesting. But it's a very interesting definition because it's agnostic about all the right stuff. It doesn't mention what you have to be made of. It doesn't mention that you have a brain. It doesn't mention how you got here. So whether you were evolved or designed or some combination of both, it doesn't say anything about any of that. What it does is it focuses on a very kind of cybernetic notion, which is that you have the ability to achieve some sort of preferential state, whether you start in different other configurations. And the thing that the control knob that we get to twist, well, there's three of them. The first one is how much competency do you have? So you could have very low competency. You could be a ball rolling down the hill, and about the only thing you know how to do is minimize your potential energy, and that's it, right? So or you might be really clever and some sort of autonomous vehicle or an animal or a human. There's all kinds of different gradations. So what competencies do you have? And then, of course, you have to specify the space in which those goals exist, right? And then you have to specify what the goals are. And all of these things are empirical. They're not, this isn't philosophy. You can't just make this up. You have to make hypotheses about this and then do the experiment and see what competencies does your system have to reach those goals in that space.
Right. So just a kind of conceptual question. Thinking about cognition, intelligence, memory, these things. How people often think of it as I'm just taking a shot at it. I think there's a lot of diverse ways how people think of cognition, but think of cognition as sort of a container for information processing systems, and then things like intentional intelligence or memory or perception seem to be added on properties of information processing systems. Is that, do you think, conceptually helpful in how to think about cognition, or would you change anything there?
I like sort of the active inference approach, kind of like Carl Friston's sort of stuff, where it's really very much at the beginning. So it's like already very simple physical systems have some ability to minimize certain quantities and to do some amount of active inference about what happens next. And so on top of that, and so I can, I can sort of tell a story if you want. I can tell a story about how I think minimal agents arise from nothing, basically. But all of the capacities that we think about, so memory and preferences, and then metacognition that lets you change your goals and so on, and then planning, and then who knows what else, right? All of these things sort of are scaled up versions of very simple things that really minimal agents are doing. So I can tell stories about metacognition in bacteria, and I can tell stories about a sense of free will in extremely minimal kinds of systems.
Right. So where, yeah, how do you address the question of where it starts? Like, is there a bottom out somewhere where there's zero cognition? I know that question is very annoying to deal with because both answers seem unsatisfying, right? Like, it seems unsatisfying to say that, oh, there's a point where it's just physics and it stops and it becomes alive, but it's also kind of ridiculous to go the other way, where you say everything is alive in some sense. So yeah, how do you deal with that?
A couple things. I'm not going to say anything about what's alive because I actually don't know of a good definition for that, and I spend no time thinking about the definition of life. Other people do, so it's a fine question, but I don't deal with that. I deal with cognition, which the question of how that overlaps with a set of things that are alive, I have no idea. So, but let's talk about cognition. Does it go all the way down? So I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet. However, I lean strongly towards the answer that in this universe there is no zero, that it does not go to zero. The reason is twofold. Number one, uh, imagine if I said to you, let's come up with the most minimal versions of what cognition would have to be. Like, what's the most minimal uh, capacity or criteria that which you would have to have. So if I think about what the most minimal capacity is, I would say it has to have two things to be on the cognitive spectrum. It has to have two things. One is it has to be able to take actions that are not fully determined by local circumstances. That means that, right, if you're a billiard ball, the only action you're ever going to take is if you're giving a push, if you're given a push by something else. That's why you're acting, right? There's nothing that happened 3 days ago that matters. There's nothing that happened, that's going to happen in the future that matters. It's nothing that happens, far away that happens. Everything's pretty local. But the ability to act with some dependency on either future states, if you're really cognitive to be able to anticipate things, or events that happened a long time ago, or events that are far away. Any ability along that axis raises the chance that you're actually cognitive. So you have to have some ability for non-local decision, non-local action. And that's the first thing. And the other thing is, I would say there has to be a reasonable story that could be told about you being a goal-directed agent. So there has to be a way to look at the system where it looks like it's pursuing some sort of goal with some level of competency, even extremely low, but some level. So having put out those two criteria, I now you realize that elementary particles already do this. So you have quantum indeterminacy, which tells you that they have this. Now, it isn't in terms of unpredictability. So you have fundamental unpredictability. Now, it's random, which is not what we want for advanced cognition. You don't want to be a random agent. That doesn't really help. But the fact that it is not fully locked down by local conditions gives you that nano, sort of minimal level of free action, right? That you could ask for. I don't know what else minimal freedom would look like if not that. and the ability to pursue goals again with least action principles. You already see that there is this like extremely low level but not zero ability to pursue goal states. You see it in photon paths, you see it in rocks, whatever. So of course, what biology does that's really amazing is scale those up in a way that just being a pile of rocks does not. Uh, so that's my one reason for thinking that there's no zero, because as I think to the most minimal things in the world that we know of, they seem to already have it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as you pointed out, that it's kind of unsatisfactory in both ways. Uh, I think the right way to think about this is to go backwards. If you start with it, so a lot of people start forward, meaning that they'll say, I just can't imagine that paramecia have hopes and dreams like us. Well, you have to do two things. First of all, of course, you scale down your expectations. No one is saying that paramecia have hopes and dreams like us, but most capacities have come from simpler versions of those capacities. And the way to think about this is not to start with paramecia and go up, is to start with you and go backwards. So assuming that you and I believe that whatever cognition is, we have it, we have something, otherwise the word means nothing. So we have something. So now let's just start walking backwards. So you walk backwards to when you were born, and you walk backwards day by day, minute by minute, and eventually you get to a spot where you are an unfertilized oocyte. And if having gotten to the position of an unfertilized oocyte, you say that, okay, all I see is physics and chemistry, I see zero cognition here, then you have to tell me, well, at what stage? Remember, we started at some reasonable level of human cognition. When did it wink out? If we get to zero, you have to tell me when it disappeared. And I mean, people, people will pick lines that are convenient for running a society. So they will say, you have agency when you can sign a contract, or when you can rent a car, which is, by the way, older than when you can vote. It's interesting, right? And going backwards. But all of this, but we know all of this is baloney, in the same way that reaching maturity on your 18th birthday is baloney. Does anything happen when the clock ticks over to 18? No, of course not. We know that. It's just convenience. So I have never heard, despite people talk about phase transitions and this and that, I think if we take development seriously, developmental biology, and we see how slow and continuous that process is, there's literally nothing that is sharp that sort of ticks over. You say, oh, well, look, on day 17 of development, this particular thing just boom happened. I mean, that just doesn't happen. So I've never heard of a convincing place to put any phase transition like that, anything that's sharp like that. So that leads me, I don't know of any way out of this. I think there's got to be cognition I think it has to be a continuum, and I think it has to go all the way down. Can I prove that there's no phase transition that happens when the 10,000th neuron sort of gets born? No, I can't prove that, but it's completely implausible to me. And I've seen no story like that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the approach of going backwards has to be more helpful because it's empirically falsifiable. You can
That's
deal
right.
with it empirically versus I feel like whenever people sit down and make definitions for what this is what life should be, this is what cognition should be, and then let's go progressively find examples of it. It never tends to work out. You can always find counterintuitive examples that throw the whole paradigm out.
Exactly. And I think that developmental biology and evolution too, uh, because you can go backwards that way as well until you get to whatever was here before archaea. Um, if you take it seriously, it's sort of the ultimate. It's to me, it's the most magical of all the sciences, because you get to see in front of your eyes. You get to see the journey that we all take from physics to mind. Like that's it. You just see it right there. You start with a pile with a pile of chemicals, and you end up with something that's going to make grand philosophical claims about being or not being an agent and so on. And so that is a slow process. You can watch it happen. It's amazing. That is where all the insights should come from.